The time-traveling murderer. Chapter 1: The First Victim. Detective Sarah Chen stared down at the body sprawled across the museum floor, her brow furrowed in confusion. The victim, a middle-aged man in a tweed jacket, lay face down in a slowly spreading pool of blood. But it was the murder weapon that caught Sarah's attention, a gleaming metallic object unlike anything she had ever seen before. "What do you make of this, Johnson?" Sarah asked her partner as she crouched down to examine the strange device more closely. It was about the size and shape of a large handgun, but instead of a barrel it had some kind of crystal lens on the front. A faint blue glow emanated from within. Detective Johnson shook his head. "Beats me. Never seen anything like it. Some kind of high-tech weapon maybe." Sarah carefully bagged the object as evidence. "We'll get the lab to take a look. Any ID on the victim?" "Yeah, wallet was still in his pocket." Dr. Alan Winters, professor of history at the local university. Sarah's eyes narrowed. A history professor murdered with a futuristic weapon in a museum. Something very strange was going on here. As the crime scene techs continued to process the area, Sarah questioned the security guard who had discovered the body during his nightly rounds. "Did you see or hear anything unusual tonight?" she asked. The guard shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Place was quiet as usual. I was just doing my normal patrol when I found him lying there." "What about the security cameras?" "That's the weird thing," the guard said. "They all went dead for about 5 minutes around the estimated time of death. When they came back online, the body was already there." Sarah frowned. Disabled security cameras pointed to a planned professional hit. But the strange murder weapon suggested something far more unusual. As she left the museum, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something much bigger and stranger than a typical homicide investigation. Little did she know just how right she was. Chapter 2: The Second Murder. 2 weeks later, Sarah was called to another bizarre crime scene. This time the victim was found in a suburban home. Amanda Lee, a 35-year-old software engineer. "Cause of death appears to be the same as our museum victim," the medical examiner told Sarah as she examined the body. "Some kind of energy weapon that caused massive internal trauma. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're sure it's the same type of weapon?" The ME nodded. "The injury patterns are identical. Has to be the same weapon or at least the same technology." Sarah shared a look with Detective Johnson. 2 victims killed by the same futuristic weapon, with no apparent connection between them. What were they dealing with here? As they searched the house, Johnson called out from the victim's home office. "Chun, you need to see this." Sarah hurried over. Johnson was pointing at the victim's computer screen, which showed a half-finished email. Sarah leaned in to read it. "I've done it. My algorithm has detected temporal anomalies that can only be explained by time travel. Someone is moving through time and changing things. I don't know who or why, but the implications are staggering. I'm going public with this tomorrow. The world needs to know. The email cut off there, never sent. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Time travel? It sounded insane, and yet it would explain the futuristic weapon. And if Amanda Lee had truly discovered proof of time travel, it gave someone a very strong motive to want her dead. "Johnson, we need to get this computer to the tech team ASAP," Sarah said. "And put out an APB. We're looking for anyone suspicious spotted in the area in the last 24 hours. Especially anyone who looks out of place or is dressed strangely." As they left the crime scene, Sarah's mind was reeling. If time travel was real, and someone was using it to commit murders, how could they possibly hope to catch them? The killer could be anywhere or anywhen. Chapter 3: The Pattern Emerges. Over the next month, 3 more bodies turned up, all killed with the same mysterious energy weapon. Sarah and Johnson worked around the clock trying to find connections between the victims, but they seemed frustratingly random. The only thing they had in common was that they were all highly intelligent and accomplished in their fields. Dr. Alan Winters, history professor. Amanda Lee, software engineer. Dr. Rajesh Patel, theoretical physicist. Maria Gonzalez, investigative journalist. Thomas Chun, no relation to Sarah, a billionaire tech entrepreneur. 5 victims. 5 brilliant minds snuffed out. But why? What was the killer's motive? Sarah had been poring over the case files for hours when Johnson burst into her office, looking excited. "I think I found something," he said, spreading out a stack of papers on her desk. "I've been digging into the backgrounds of all our victims, looking at their family histories. Check this out." He pointed to a series of dates. Alan Winter's great-grandfather immigrated to America in 1910. Amanda Lee's great-great-grandmother came over on a boat from China in 1925. What's the connection? Johnson grinned. "Don't you see? If any of those ancestors hadn't come to America when they did, or had ended up somewhere else, our victims would never have been born." Sarah's eyes widened as she grasped the implication. "So you're saying our killer isn't just traveling through time. They're specifically targeting people whose ancestors immigrated here. They're trying to erase them from history." It was a chilling theory, but it fit the evidence. But who would want to do such a thing? And how could they hope to stop someone with the power to rewrite history itself? Chapter 4: The Witness. Sarah was working late one night when she got a call from a patrol officer about a disturbance at a local park. A homeless man was ranting about seeing a ghost appear out of thin air. Normally Sarah would have ignored it, but something made her decide to check it out herself. She found the man, disheveled and wild-eyed, being questioned by two uniformed officers. As she approached, she could hear him babbling. "I'm telling you, he just appeared. Wearing this weird silver suit. There was this blue flash, and the jogger just vanished. Like he was never there. Then the silver guy disappeared again." The officers clearly thought the man was crazy or on drugs. But Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A man in a silver suit appearing out of nowhere with a weapon that matched their murder weapon? It was the first potential lead they'd had in weeks. "Sir," she said gently, crouching down beside the homeless man. "Every detail, no matter how strange it seems." The man's story poured out in a frantic jumble. He described seeing a shimmering in the air, like heat waves, and then a man simply appearing as if from nowhere. The stranger wore a skin-tight silver suit that covered him head to toe, with a helmet that obscured his face. Then he had focused on a jogger running past and raised his arm, pointing a metallic object. There was a flash of blue light, and the jogger simply winked out of existence mid-stride. Nobody else saw it. The man insisted. It was like the jogger had never even been there. No one noticed him vanish. Just me. Sarah listened intently, her mind racing. If this account was true, it suggested their killer wasn't just traveling through time. He was somehow erasing his victims from the timeline entirely, removing all trace of their existence. It was no wonder they hadn't been able to find any connections between the victims. In the killer's altered timeline, they had never existed at all. "Thank you," Sarah told the man sincerely. "You've been incredibly helpful. We're going to get you somewhere safe for the night. Okay?" As she arranged for the witness to be taken to a shelter, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Johnson. "Sixth body found. Same MO. You need to see this." Sarah's heart sank. Another victim. But maybe now, armed with this new information, they could finally start to make some progress on the case. She just hoped they could do it before the killer struck again. Chapter 5: The Profiler. With the case taking such a bizarre turn, Sarah decided it was time to bring in some outside help. She reached out to Dr. Eliza Vance, a renowned criminal profiler who specialized in unusual cases. Dr. Vance arrived at the precinct the next morning, a tall woman with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes. Sarah and Johnson spent several hours briefing her on all the details of the case, including their theory about time travel and the witness account from the park. To her credit, Dr. Vance took it all in stride, asking pointed questions and taking copious notes. When they were done, she sat back with a thoughtful expression. "Well, this is certainly one of the more unique cases I've encountered," she said. "But if we accept the premise that we're dealing with a time-traveling killer, we can still apply standard profiling techniques to try to understand their psychology and motivations." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "What's your assessment?" Dr. Vance tapped her pen against her notepad. "Based on the information you've given me, I believe we're dealing with an extremist with a messiah complex. And statistically it's most likely he believes he's on a mission to save or purify the country, possibly the world, by preventing certain bloodlines from ever coming to America. A time-traveling white supremacist? Johnson asked incredulously. Dr. Vance nodded. Essentially, yes. But one with a god complex. He likely sees himself as the only one with the knowledge and power to correct history and create his ideal vision of America. The fact that he's targeting accomplished, intelligent victims suggests he sees them as the biggest threats, people whose contributions to society go against his warped worldview. Sarah frowned. But how did he get access to time travel technology in the first place? That's the million-dollar question, Dr. Vance said. My guess would be that he's from the future, perhaps a scientist or researcher who had access to experimental technology and decided to use it for his own ends. Or he could have stolen it. Either way, he's intelligent, methodical, and absolutely convinced of the righteousness of his cause. That makes him extremely dangerous. So how do we stop someone who can literally rewrite history? Johnson asked. Dr. Vance's expression was grim. With great difficulty. Your best bet is to try to predict his next target and catch him in the act. Look for prominent figures who match the profile of his previous victims, highly accomplished children or grandchildren of immigrants, and pray you can get to him before he erases them from existence. Chapter 6, The Trap. Armed with Dr. Vance's profile, Sarah and Johnson began combing through records, looking for potential future victims. They focused on notable figures in science, technology, and academia who had recent immigrant ancestry. After several days of research, they had compiled a list of a dozen possible targets. But how to protect them all? They couldn't exactly go public with warnings about a time-traveling killer. In the end, they decided to focus their efforts on the most likely target, Dr. Sofia Reyes, a brilliant young astrophysicist whose grandparents had immigrated from Mexico in the 1970s. Dr. Reyes was scheduled to give a lecture at the university that weekend. Sarah coordinated with campus security to set up an elaborate surveillance operation. Plainclothes officers were stationed throughout the lecture hall and surrounding areas. Sarah and Johnson monitored everything from a command center in a nearby building, banks of screens showing feeds from hidden cameras. As Dr. Reyes took the stage to begin her talk, Sarah felt the tension ratcheting up. For the first hour, everything was quiet. But just as Dr. Reyes was wrapping up her lecture, one of the screens lit up with sudden activity. A shimmering distortion appeared in the air near the back of the auditorium, coalescing into the figure of a man in a silver suit. There! Sarah shouted, pointing at the screen. All units move in. Do not let him fire that weapon. But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah realized they were too late. The figure raised his arm, the familiar energy weapon gleaming. There was a flash of blue light, and then the screens went blank. For a moment, Sarah thought the cameras had malfunctioned. But as they came back online seconds later, she realized with dawning horror what had happened. The podium stood empty. No, Sarah breathed. We lost her. He erased her. Johnson slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. Damn it. But as they watched the feeds, Sarah noticed something odd. Instead, he was looking around in apparent confusion, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. He's still there, Sarah said, hope rising in her chest. This is our chance. They watched tensely as the plainclothes officers closed in. The killer seemed to finally notice he was being surrounded. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, one of the officers tackled him from behind. Sarah got her first look at the face of the man who had been terrorizing the city. He glared at Sarah with undisguised hatred as she approached. You have no idea what you've done, he spat. I was saving the world. Preserving the purity of Dash. Save it, Sarah cut him off coldly. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. As they led him away, Sarah felt a mix of triumph and unease. They had caught the killer, yes. But Dr. Reyes, and who knew how many others were still gone, erased from history. How could they ever hope to set things right? Chapter 7, Interrogation. Sarah watched him through the one-way glass, trying to formulate a strategy. What do you think? Johnson asked, coming to stand beside her. Sarah shook her head. This guy thinks he's on a holy mission. We need to try a different approach. I know who you are, Sarah said quietly. Or at least I know what you are. You're from the future. You came back in time on what you believe is a righteous mission to purify America by preventing immigration. You think you're saving the world. That got his attention. His eyes flicked to her face, narrowing slightly. But here's what I don't understand, Sarah continued. You clearly have incredibly advanced technology. In your time, humanity must have made amazing strides. So why come back and try to undo all of that progress? Why erase the very people whose descendants might go on to cure diseases or make revolutionary discoveries? For a moment Sarah thought he would maintain his silence, but then he spoke, his voice low and intense. Overrun by foreigners, our culture and values destroyed. I'm trying to prevent that future from ever happening. By murdering innocent people? They're not innocent. The killer snarled, slamming his hand on the table. They and their kind are responsible. Chapter 8: The Confession. Sarah remained calm, meeting the killer's gaze steadily. Responsible for what, exactly? For contributing to society? For bringing new ideas and perspectives that have helped humanity advance? The killer's eyes flashed with anger. For weakening our nation with their foreign ways? You're one of them. Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her voice steady. The killer sneered. You're blind. You can't see the damage that's been done. But it's not too late. I can still fix things. Sarah leaned back, considering her next move. She needed to get him to reveal more about his methods and motivations. How did you get access to time travel technology? Did you create it yourself? The killer hesitated, then smirked. Let's just say I had some help from people who understand the importance of my mission. People from your time? Sarah pressed. Or from this one? He didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes told her she was on the right track. There were others involved, possibly even in the present day. You're not working alone, Sarah said, more to herself than to him. You have allies. People who share your twisted vision. The killer's smirk widened. You'll never find them. And even if you did, it wouldn't matter. The timeline is already changing. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She needed to find a way to undo the damage this man had caused, but without knowing more about how his technology worked, it seemed an impossible task. Tell me how it works, she said, trying a different tactic. Your time travel device. How do you decide where and when to go? The killer laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You think I'd just give that information to you? You're even more naive than I thought. Sarah sighed, realizing she wasn't going to get any more useful information from him. She stood up, signaling to Johnson to take over. They had stopped the killer, but the damage to the timeline remained. Somehow they had to find a way to set things right. Determined to find answers, Sarah reached out to Dr. Emily Carter, a physicist specializing in theoretical time travel. Dr. Carter had been a consultant on several government projects and was one of the few people Sarah trusted to understand the complexities of the situation. Dr. Carter agreed to meet Sarah at the precinct. She was a petite woman with curly brown hair and an air of quiet intelligence. As Sarah explained the situation, Dr. Carter listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. This is unprecedented, Dr. Carter said finally, her voice tinged with awe and concern. If what you're saying is true, and someone is actively altering the timeline, the implications are staggering. Is there any way to reverse the changes? Sarah asked, desperation creeping into her voice. To bring back the people he's erased? Dr. Carter tapped her pen thoughtfully. In theory, if we could access the same technology he used, we might be able to undo his actions. Even a small change can have massive ripple effects. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. What about the device we confiscated from him? Could you examine it and see if there's a way to use it to restore the timeline? Dr. Carter looked intrigued. I'd need to see it first, but it's possible. If I can understand how it works, I might be able to create a countermeasure. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. I'll get you access to the device. Whatever you need, just let me know. They had a long road ahead, but with the right expertise and a bit of luck, they might just be able to set things right. Chapter 10: The Race Against Time. Over the next few days, Dr. Carter worked tirelessly, examining the confiscated time travel device. She set up a makeshift lab in the precinct, surrounded by computers and scientific equipment. Sarah checked in regularly, eager for any updates. Finally, after several sleepless nights, Dr. Carter called Sarah into the lab, her eyes bright with excitement. "I think I've got it," Dr. Carter said, gesturing to a complex array of machinery. "I've managed to reverse engineer the device enough to understand its basic functions. It uses a form of quantum entanglement to anchor itself to specific points in time. Does that mean you can use it to undo the changes the killer made?" Dr. Carter nodded, though her expression was cautious. "In theory, yes. But it's incredibly risky." The risk was great, but the alternative was leaving the timeline altered with countless lives erased. She knew what she had to do. "Let's do it," Sarah said firmly. "We can't let him win." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll need your help." Together, they worked to calibrate the device, setting the coordinates to the points in time where the killer had struck. As they activated the machine, Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if the world around her was shifting and warping. Chapter 11. The Restoration. Sarah felt a sense of déjà vu as she looked around the museum, the scene eerily similar to the night of the first murder. She knew she had to act quickly to prevent the killer from altering the timeline. She spotted the killer, his silver suit glinting under the museum lights, as he approached Dr. Alan Winters. "Dr. Winters, get down!" she shouted, drawing her weapon. The killer turned, surprise etched on his face as he saw Sarah. Dr. Winters, realizing the danger, ducked behind a display case. Sarah advanced on the killer, her weapon trained on him. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "You won't hurt anyone else." The killer glared at her, but before he could respond, the temporal field around them began to destabilize. Sarah felt a tugging sensation, as if reality itself was unraveling. The timeline is correcting itself. She activated the return function on the device, feeling the familiar sensation of being pulled through time. Chapter 12. The New Timeline. When the world came back into focus, Sarah found herself back in the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds grounding her in the present. Johnson burst into the room, a wide grin on his face. "You did it, Chan. The timeline's been restored. All the victims are back, alive and well." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief flooding through her. They had done it. They had reversed the damage and saved countless lives. Dr. Carter approached, looking both exhausted and exhilarated. "We couldn't have done it without you, Detective." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment and gratitude. They had faced an unimaginable threat and emerged victorious. The timeline was safe, at least for now. As she left the precinct, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the strange and incredible journey they had been on. The world was full of mysteries, and she knew there would always be new challenges to face. But for now, she was content to enjoy the present, knowing that the future was once again filled with endless possibilities. In the days following the restoration of the timeline, Sarah found herself grappling with the enormity of what had transpired. The world around her seemed unchanged, yet she carried the weight of memories from an altered history that no one else remembered. She visited each of the would-be victims, discreetly checking on their well-being. Dr. Alan Winters was busy preparing for a new exhibition at the museum. Dr. Rajesh Patel, Maria Gonzalez, Thomas Chun, and Dr. Sophia Reyes, all alive, all continuing to make their valuable contributions to society. As she watched Dr. Reyes giving a televised lecture on recent astronomical discoveries, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and purpose. The diversity and richness of American society remained intact, not erased by a misguided zealot from the future. But nagging questions remained. Who were the killer's allies? Were there others out there with access to time travel technology? And what of the future he had come from? Was it truly as dire as he had claimed, or was it merely a product of his warped worldview? Sarah knew she couldn't rest on her laurels. The threat might have been neutralized for now, but the potential for further temporal interference remained. Chapter 14. The Task Force. 2 weeks after the resolution of the case, Sarah was called into the chief's office. She found not only her superior but also several stern-looking government officials waiting for her. "Detective Chen," the chief began, his tone serious. "In light of recent events, a decision has been made at the highest levels. We're forming a specialized task force to deal with potential temporal threats, and we want you to lead it." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Sir." One of the officials, a woman in a crisp suit, stepped forward. "Detective, your experience with this case is unique. You've demonstrated not only the ability to adapt to unprecedented situations, but also a deep understanding of the ethical implications of time travel. We need someone like you at the helm of this operation." Sarah's mind raced. This was far beyond anything she had ever imagined for her career. But she also knew that she was perhaps uniquely qualified for such a role. What exactly would this task force do? "Monitor for temporal anomalies," the official explained. "Investigate any signs of time travel or alterations to the timeline. And if necessary, take action to preserve the integrity of history." Sarah took a deep breath, considering the immense responsibility being offered to her. Finally, she nodded. "I'll do it." The chief smiled, relief evident on his face. "Excellent. You'll be working closely with Dr. Carter and a team of specialists. Your first priority will be to track down any potential collaborators of our time-traveling killer." As Sarah left the office, her head spinning with the implications of her new role, she couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. The world had suddenly become a much larger, more complex place. But she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 15: The Hidden Threat. Sarah's new task force hit the ground running. They set up a state-of-the-art facility, equipped with advanced technology designed to detect temporal anomalies. Dr. Carter led a team of scientists working on understanding and replicating the time travel device they had confiscated. For several months, things were quiet. Sarah and her team investigated a few false alarms, but nothing concrete emerged. One of the temporal sensors began blaring an alarm. Dr. Carter rushed into Sarah's office, her face pale. "We've detected a massive temporal disturbance," she said breathlessly. "It's like nothing we've seen before." As they gathered in the command center, reports began flooding in from around the world. Strange phenomena were being reported globally, people and buildings disappearing, others appearing out of nowhere, history itself seeming to rewrite before people's eyes. "It's not just one time traveler," Sarah realized with growing horror. "It's multiple incursions, all happening simultaneously." Dr. Carter nodded grimly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered the words of the killer they had caught. "You'll never find them. And even if you did, it wouldn't matter. The timeline is already changing." This was what he had been hinting at, a massive orchestrated assault on the very fabric of time itself. The killer they had stopped was just the tip of the iceberg. As reports of chaos and confusion poured in from around the globe, Sarah steeled herself for the fight ahead. This was no longer just about preserving American history. The entire world's past, present, and future were at stake. "All right, listen up," she addressed her team, her voice firm and determined. "This is what we've been preparing for. We're the last line of defense against whoever is trying to rewrite history. We need to identify the source of these incursions and stop them before it's too late." As her team sprang into action, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The fate of the world, of all of history, now rested in their hands. Whatever came next, she knew that the greatest challenge of her life was just beginning. Chapter 16: The Temporal War. The next few days were a blur of activity as Sarah's task force worked around the clock to combat the temporal assault. They identified multiple points of incursion across different time periods, each one threatening to unravel the timeline in its own way. Using the reverse-engineered time travel technology, Sarah led teams on surgical strikes into the past, working to counteract the changes being made by the mysterious enemy. It was grueling, high-stakes work. Every mission carried the risk of further damaging the timeline or becoming trapped in the past. As they fought this shadowy war across time, a pattern began to emerge. The incursions weren't random. They were targeting key moments in history, attempting to reshape the world into some twisted new form. During a rare moment of downtime, Sarah conferred with Dr. Carter and her top analysts. She asked, rubbing her tired eyes, "What are they trying to accomplish?" Dr. Carter pulled up a holographic display showing a timeline crisscrossed with points of interference. "From what we can tell, they're systematically attempting to prevent the rise of multicultural societies." Every incursion is aimed at either stopping key migrations, preventing cultural exchanges, or eliminating influential figures who promoted diversity and inclusion. It's not just one extremist. It's an entire organization, possibly from that same xenophobic future our original killer came from. One of the analysts nodded grimly. They seem to be trying to create a sort of global ethno-state, a world without the cultural mixing and exchange that has driven so much of human progress. The implications were staggering. If these time travelers succeeded, they would create a world of isolated, stagnant cultures, devoid of the innovation and dynamism that diversity brought. It would be a darker, smaller world, one that might never achieve the technological advances that had made time travel possible in the first place. We can't let that happen, Sarah said firmly. We need to find their base of operations. Cut this off at the source. As if on cue, an alarm blared. One of the technicians called out, "We've got another incursion." Multiple temporal signatures converging on Washington, D.C., July 4, 1776. Sarah's eyes widened. The signing of the Declaration of Independence. She turned to her team, determination etched on her face. This is it. They're going for a decisive strike at the very foundation of American history. We need to stop them here and now. As they prepared for what might be their final mission, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had led her to this point. From a routine murder investigation to the front lines of a war for the soul of history itself. Whatever happened next, she knew that the fate of not just her country, but the entire world hung in the balance. Chapter 17, The Battle for Independence. Sarah and her elite team materialized in a quiet alley in Philadelphia, July 3, 1776. They were dressed in period-appropriate clothing, their advanced weaponry and equipment carefully concealed. "Remember," Sarah whispered to her team, "we can't risk altering history ourselves. Our job is to stop the incursion and preserve the timeline as it should be. No interaction with historical figures unless absolutely necessary." They split into groups, taking up strategic positions around Independence Hall. Sarah's instincts told her that's where the enemy would strike. As night fell, the tension was palpable. In the early hours of July 4th, Sarah's vigilance paid off. A shimmer in the air near the hall's entrance signaled the arrival of the temporal invaders. 5 figures in advanced stealth suits materialized, weapons at the ready. Sarah's team sprang into action. A firefight erupted, energy weapons flashing in the pre-dawn darkness. The invaders were skilled, but Sarah's team had the element of surprise. As they battled, Sarah noticed one of the invaders breaking away, heading for the hall's entrance. She pursued, dodging energy blasts and leaping over fallen debris. Inside Independence Hall, Sarah cornered the invader in the assembly room, where the Declaration of Independence lay waiting to be signed. The invader held a device that Sarah recognized as a temporal eraser, capable of wiping the document from history. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, her weapon trained on the figure. "You don't know what you're doing. Erasing this document won't just change American history, it'll reshape the entire world." The invader hesitated, then spoke, the voice distorted by their helmet. "That's the point. We're creating a better world. A purer one." Sarah shook her head. "You're creating a world of isolation and stagnation. This document, these ideas of freedom and equality, they've inspired people all over the world for centuries. Yes, America has made mistakes, but the principles laid out here have driven progress and positive change globally." For a moment, the invader seemed to waver. Then, with lightning speed, they raised the eraser device. Sarah fired, her shot precisely disabling the device. As it sparked and fizzled, the invader lunged at her. They grappled, crashing into tables and chairs. As they fought, the first rays of sunlight began to stream through the windows. Sarah managed to get the upper hand, pinning the invader down. "Your mission has failed." Just then the door burst open. As they secured the prisoner, Sarah heard footsteps approaching. Her eyes widened as she recognized the figures entering the room. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. What is the meaning of this commotion? Sarah thought quickly. "Forgive us, gentlemen. We're an advanced security detail. We've apprehended some British spies who were attempting to sabotage your important work." The founding fathers looked skeptical, but seemed to accept the explanation. They were already turning their attention to the document on the table, the course of history set to continue as it should. Outside, as they prepared to return to their own time, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with humility. They had preserved a pivotal moment in history, ensuring that the ideas of liberty and equality would continue to shape the world for centuries to come. Chapter 18: Ripples in Time. Back in the present, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to assess the aftermath of their temporal battle. Dr. Carter's instruments showed that the major temporal disturbances had ceased, but there were still anomalies to address. "It's like ripples in a pond," Dr. Carter explained, gesturing to a holographic display of the timeline. "We stopped the main incursion, but the effects of their actions are still propagating through history. We need to smooth out these ripples to fully stabilize the timeline." Over the next few weeks, Sarah led smaller teams on precision missions to various points in history, subtly correcting small changes that had occurred as a result of the temporal war. They saved a young immigrant from an accident that hadn't occurred in the original timeline, ensured a key cultural exchange program wasn't canceled, and prevented the destruction of important historical records. It was delicate work, requiring a deep understanding of historical cause and effect. One small change could have massive repercussions down the line. Sarah found herself developing a profound appreciation for the interconnectedness of history and the delicate balance of events that had led to the present day. As they worked, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the enormity of what they had accomplished and what they had prevented. The world they had preserved was far from perfect, but it was a world of diversity, of cultural exchange and growth, of progress born from the mixing of ideas and peoples. Chapter 19: The Future Unwritten. With the timeline stabilized and the immediate threat neutralized, Sarah's task force turned their attention to a new problem: preventing future temporal incursions. Working with Dr. Carter and a team of the world's top scientists, they developed new technologies to detect and prevent unauthorized time travel. They set up a global network of temporal sensors and established protocols for responding to any future threats. But Sarah knew that technology alone wasn't the answer. The root of the problem lay in the future, a future where some had become so fearful of change and diversity that they were willing to erase history itself. "We need to ensure that future never comes to pass," Sarah told her team. "Our job isn't just to protect history, it's to build a better future." She proposed a bold new initiative, using their knowledge of potential futures to guide present-day policy. Not to control or manipulate, but to educate and inform, helping leaders understand the long-term consequences of their decisions. It was a controversial idea, fraught with ethical concerns. But after much debate and careful consideration, a framework was established. Sarah's task force would serve as advisors, providing insights into potential futures without directly interfering in the political process. As she looked out over the city from her office window, Sarah felt a mix of hope and trepidation. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities both bright and dark. But for the first time, humanity had the tools to shape that future with true foresight. The time-traveling murderer had sought to erase diversity from history. In the end, he had only succeeded in proving how essential that diversity was to human progress. Sarah smiled, thinking of the rich tapestry of cultures and ideas that had been preserved. The world wasn't perfect, but it was filled with potential. And now, armed with the lessons of history and insights into possible futures, they had the chance to build something truly remarkable. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues, Sarah turned back to her work. The future was calling, and she was ready to answer. Epilogue: Guardians of Time. Years passed and Sarah's task force evolved into a respected global organization known as the Temporal Guardians. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes, protecting the integrity of history and helping to guide humanity towards a brighter future. Sarah, now the senior director of the Guardians, stood before a group of new recruits. Her hair had begun to gray, but her eyes still shone with the same determination and passion that had driven her all those years ago. "You're about to embark on the most important work imaginable," she told them. "Protecting not just our past, but our future. Remember, every moment in history, every culture, every individual has value. Our job is to ensure that the tapestry of human experience remains rich and diverse." As she looked out at the eager faces before her, Sarah felt a profound sense of hope. The future was still unwritten, but with each passing day, they were helping to ensure it would be a future of unity, progress, and boundless potential. The time-traveling murderer and his allies had sought to create a world of isolation and stagnation. Instead, they had inadvertently given humanity the tools to forge a more connected, more enlightened civilization. As Sarah dismissed the recruits, her comm device chimed. A new temporal anomaly had been detected. She smiled, ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. The work of protecting history and the future was never done. But with each passing day, the world they were building grew brighter. The future, in all its infinite possibilities, awaited.
Subscribe for more.